And welcome to the Royal Beat Back in Time with me, Kate Thornton. In this series, we bring you the stories from the monarchy from years gone by. And today, we're focusing on royal figures around the world at a very specific time in their life, when they became adults. From young Empress Matilda shaping the fate of the nations to Elizabeth I exceeding all expectations. We explore the lives of some pretty remarkable and notable 18-year-olds. And here to tell you all about them, I'm delighted to be joined by three incredible historians. Dr. Elizabeth Norton's back with us, Professor Kate Williams, and Alice Loxton, whose new book, 18, A History of Young Britain in 18 Young Lives, brings to life some of the incredible stories that we're going to be discussing and pulling into focus today. So welcome, one and all. Nice to see you. Lovely to have you two back. Alice, your first time with us on the Royal Beat.
Yeah, thrilled to be here.
Look at that, Dan Snow, one of our finest historians. Loxton is the next big thing in history. So I'm taking it as read that you know your onions.
I hope so.
I'm looking for it. What a fascinating book. Where did the idea of honing in on their 18th year come from for you?
Well, I think the age of 18 is really important for us today. And in many ways, it's this modern concept, it's this modern age, because this is when we consider, young people becoming adults, leaving childhood, if you like. But of course, when you apply that to history, that's not actually quite the case. And people have the marks of adulthood happening much earlier, getting married or having careers or having children. And so I basically just wanted to take this modern concept, apply it to the past and see what strange and remarkable experiences people have had.
I mean, you say strange and remarkable. I mean, in today's culture, it would not happen. Some of the stuff that we're about to explore, so much was heaped on such incredibly young shoulders in so many of the cases of the people that we're going to discuss here today. Remarkable strain for young people to carry. And yet, in history, when you read, Empress Matilda or Queen Elizabeth, you think about nothing but the good side, the perks of that position. And actually, as we're about to discover, these people had to be remarkably stoic.
Yes, I mean, I think we often look at Elizabeth I, say, and think, well, she's in the top 1%, the top 0.1% of people who've ever lived in this country and that she was born into royalty. But of course, she faced pretty extraordinary challenges that, her childhood was pretty traumatic, I'd say. So it's kind of uncovering those, or reshaping people's perceptions of lots of famous figures from history. And yeah, you're right. I mean, they've done some remarkable things. Take even the example of Nelson. When he was 12, he'd gone to sea. And so by the time he was 18, he'd gone on an expedition to the Caribbean, to the Arctic, and to India in that part of the world, and almost died of malaria, all before he was 18 years old, which is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah,
and he's probably more travelling than any of us will ever do in our whole lives. But what's interesting is that in these situations where young people, who today would just be, they're challenged by GCSEs or A-levels or school exams, in the past they were challenged in extraordinary ways in having this immense amount of responsibility. But in that situation, so often they step up to the mark. And it's amazing, I think, what young people are capable of when push comes to shove. And it's obviously wonderful in today's society that young people can just, have that space to learn and study and things. But it shows that young people have great potential.
As a history show, all about the monarchy, obviously, the clue is in the title, we're going to focus on some of the royal individuals that are featured in your book. And first up, let's start with Empress Matilda. What do we know about Empress Matilda and why is she so significant?
So Empress Matilda is an early medieval queen, but she's born in 1102. She's born as the daughter of King Henry, who was a son of William the Conqueror, so very, very early, kind of the Norman period. And her mother was a Scottish queen, so half Scottish, half English, if you like.
So they were like the power couple of the day, right? So you've got the King and Queen of England and Scotland, and is that right?
Well, she's Scottish, the mother, but they come together and they are the King and Queen of England, if you like. And they have two children, William and Matilda. And so she's born into royalty, we think perhaps at Winchester. That's a suggested location where she might be born. We're not quite sure, so it's all quite murky, her early days.
But it is very, we're talking about 1102 here.
Yeah, so it's quite
so I'll forgive you for being a little vague on the details. But she comes from quite a dynasty, doesn't she? When we roll back the history books a little further, Henry's father was William the Conqueror, so that's her grandfather.
Yeah.
And the Matilda's great uncle was Edward the Confessor. So she comes from pretty hardy and impressive stock, would you say?
Yeah, she does. So she is royal on both sides of the family, really royal. I mean, there's an argument that she's the heiress to the Anglo-Saxon kings as well, through her mother's family. She's a Norman queen. She's related to pretty much everyone who counts in Europe.
And, I mean, she's got everything. She's got everything setting out. I mean, she is, such a sensational heir. But obviously, the key thing is that she's not male. So everything is going to go to her brother, and all the hopes as the next king go to her brother. And then he's fatally killed in what we might say is the medieval Titanic, in the huge catastrophe of the White Ship, when the flower of manhood, including him, goes down. And I think it's just a sort of butcher who survives clinging onto some wood. And therefore, you then have the situation that you have a female heir. And they hadn't had Elizabeth.
And no spare, right?
No spare. And they hadn't had Elizabeth I by then. They hadn't had anyone. And of course, the monarch is supposed to be a warrior, and a woman can't lead you into battle. So having a female heir, that seems to be a disaster. Even though Henry says she's the one, guys, she's the one, people are pretty concerned about a female heir because they just don't think they can rule.
But so by the time this happens at 18 in her life, right, she's 18 when her brother dies, he goes down on that ship. But by then, what had already happened to her? Because...
Well, she's had a pretty extraordinary teenage years already. And the reason that I was really keen to include Matilda was because at the age of 18, this really extraordinary thing happens where her entire life changes, the White Ship disaster. But before that, so... as a royal princess, she is married she is betrothed and then married to Heinrich V, who is the Holy Roman Emperor, and he is one of the most powerful men in Europe. So it's an amazing marriage.
So in many ways, it's kind of emulating the power play that we see in the marriage between her parents, right?
Yeah, and I think when Matilda was out there in basically what is the area that we know as Germany today, taking on these very, important roles, at some point she's in charge of Italy, essentially, on behalf of her husband, she would have perceived
it's a bit casually, the way you drop that, but she's in charge of Italy.
Yeah.
In the absence of... So her husband goes off to fight in Germany.
Well, it's basically this huge area that they're in control of, and together they're in charge of managing it, and, this is a very difficult relationship with the Pope, but they're pretty important figures in Europe, and she, it's credit to her that she's completely trusted as someone who could be left in command of a large area on her husband's behalf, and that's only in her late teens.
So she's in her late teens.
She's a teenager.
She's a teenager in charge of Italy,
and she's the whole Queen of Italy. Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
I don't think I could quite tidy my bedroom at that.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. But then, so we have to think about. So when Matilda was 6, a group of men with strange accents and unfamiliar clothing visited the palace, and that's when we know the deal was done, right, for her to go off and marry Henrik. At 8, she boards a ship destined for Boulogne and would never see her mother or her brother again, and becomes entrenched in life as his wife. How old is she when they marry?
So I think she's 12 when they marry officially, they tie the knot, and she's crowned in these amazing ceremonies.
Think Bridgerton with twice the budget.
Yeah.
And that's her wedding.
Extra jewels.
Yeah. Yeah. It was the society event of Europe, wasn't it?
She was there on her own. I always think of her as like this young girl, and she's there in this foreign country. She doesn't know anyone, really. These aren't her family and close friends. It must have been very lonely. Do you think?
And that's your life, isn't it? You're as a woman, you're sent off to another court, and often you have to lose all your friends, all your ladies in waiting, and you're supposed to be totally absorbed into the new court. And it must be heartbreaking. Now weddings are a big family celebration, but they're someone else's family, and the wedding is a complete signifier for you as a bride that you've forgotten the past, and now you're supposed to be completely absorbed and part of the new life.
So really, she had to think of herself as German now. She was German speaking. That was her first tongue. Like you say, so much of her past erased. And then, after the wedding, her brother dies.
Everything changes.
Everything changes. Let's call it a rebrand.
Yeah, and absolutely. And she's gone from being German, because she will have she won't have anyone to speak English to at the German court. So she goes from being a German queen to suddenly being this English heiress, and she's got to go back.
But isn't it, I think we always...
So she comes back to what, rule the UK? Rule England?
Well, I think
her father's still in charge.
Yeah, so I think it's important to just note, like, the late teen years, because her perception and her view of what her life would be like, surely, would have been that she would be in this position with Heinrich. She would give birth to some children, and they would be the heirs. And so at that point, you know, that's what she imagines her life will be like. How could
Popping out Holy Roman Empress.
Yeah. Could she have possibly imagined how much it would all change? And this is the problem with history. We always look back with hindsight, and it always, you know, we forget that she had no idea this was happening.
She had no idea what was coming down the track. She didn't know she was going to be in charge of Italy.
And an astonishing marriage, really, for her to make. I mean, England isn't much of a power at the time, so for her to marry the Holy Roman Emperor, I mean, it really is. It's a huge step up. So, you know, she's arrived now.
And she's clearly proud of it. I mean, she'll use the title Empress for the rest of her life. It's clearly a huge deal for her.
But then, you know, so as we understand it from what little we can garner from the history books, her marriage to Henry V was a happy one, and it ended when he died, we believe, of cancer in 1125. So whilst the marriage didn't last long, it kind of set Matilda up on a political stage that she hadn't ever envisaged having to play on. And Alice, you say, and I know you kind of agree to some degree, that she went on to be remembered as one of the best politicians of our time. How does that happen?
Well, you know, she's got to this very heady height and having a huge amount of responsibility, but then she comes back and all of this kind of civil war unravels in England. It's known as the Anarchy.
She's widowed at this point?
So the key three events, I think, in her young life are 1120, when her brother dies, and so she's the only heir to her father. Then it's surprising that she doesn't have any children with Heinrich, because that would have kept her within that Holy Roman Emperor world. And then Heinrich dies, surprisingly. And so then suddenly, against all odds, she's completely cut out of having a role.
That life that she's created for herself.
In three different reasons.
And that empire she's been ruling quite successfully, actually, while he's been off at war. As a young teenage woman.
But then she comes back, and when her father dies, and her brothers died, she suddenly, I suppose, you know, because she isn't put straight in a position of being a queen in England, because she doesn't assume that position, it's her cousin Stephen who takes that position. I feel like she's in a bit of a, never really knows quite who she is or what she is. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and I think she's... Sorry.
It's a dual existence, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think she also struggles with the men in her life. And I think really in this period, you know, I mean, it's a patriarchal society. She's supposed to be under the control of her father, and he really does assert himself. He gets her back to be the heir to the throne, but it's on his terms. So he marries her off to a teenager.
He marries her off to a 15-year-old.
Yeah, she is 26.
That's
horrified by it.
And she doesn't like this new guy.
No, he has to lock... According to the sources, Henry has to lock her in her room to get her to agree to the marriage. It's a disaster. They do have sons. That's the only sort of saving grace of it.
She has 3 children, but we believe that she left him, which nobody did that in marriage in those days. She left him as soon as the 3rd son was born. Literally, bye-bye.
She had the 3. That was it. It was secure. And yes, I think, obviously, you know...
I mean, that's quite ballsy.
That is... I mean, she was totally ballsy. This is, as we said, this is a woman who ruled Italy. I mean, and she's also... I mean, she's the ultimate survivor. I mean, she survives so much the death of her brother, the death of her husband. Of course, you can die from anything in this period, but she is the ultimate survivor. And I think, you know, she's like Elizabeth I that we'll talk about later. She has these incredible survival skills, and she knows that everyone around her is out for her power and that you can't trust anyone. And that's what I think makes her so powerful. And then we have, you know, I mean, to me, she really is England's greatest queen that never was. I mean, I think she would have been such a successful monarch if she had that throne. But Stephen, her cousin, nipped in and stole it before she got a chance to get back in time.
Talk to me about Stephen. Who's Stephen?
So Stephen's the cousin. Basically, after the White Ship disaster, there's... You know,
where she loses her brother.
Yeah, it confuses who the heirs are. And
I mean, this hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. It's not, I mean, at first I thought, has one of your kids done it? But no, seemingly not. This is Stephen.
Looking good.
Yeah, painted by someone who obviously didn't like it.
I would say so, yeah.
Oh, he was very, very ugly. This is flattering.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Stephen was the fly in her in her ointment, wasn't he?
Yeah, so there's it's this kind of tussle between the two. Stephen takes the throne, but Matilda's this ongoing threat throughout his reign, and that is known as this civil war. It's described in these terrible terms like Christ and his saints were asleep. You know, that's how bad it was for people at the time. Of course, you know, you can debate whether that was quite the case, but it's a civil war known as the Anarchy, and this is the thing that defines Matilda's life. This is what it defines how we remember her in history. And I think that's, when you think back to teenage Matilda, could she have possibly known that she would have been in this strange civil war in this situation? I don't think so. But I think, you know, we mentioned about her being this amazing politician or diplomat. Like, that's the kind of conclusion I came to think about her. Because the way that she manoeuvres through lots of these situations, when she might not be the one that's on the throne, but it's her son who comes to the throne, and, you know, all of that drama with Thomas Becket. Yeah. She's dealing with lots of those things, and dealing with lots of, you know, European kind of figures. I just got that impression. Did you feel the same?
Yeah, I mean, I think the odds are really stacked against her. And she hangs on. Her husband...
She doesn't just hang on, though, does she? She
No.
starts to carve out paths for women that were followed by the likes of Elizabeth I, who we'll talk about a little later. She really challenged and changed gender norms whilst being completely under the cosh the whole time.
Oh, she does, and she gets so criticised for it. So every time Matilda is criticised, it's because she's not womanly, she's too... she's arrogant because she expects her followers to come to her on their knees, or, you know, she's giving the orders. They're criticising her for behaving like a king, behaving like a monarch. And
Behaving like a man.
Behaving like a man. But actually, that's how you get on in the 12th century, and Matilda really understands it and also knows her position. She knows her rights. She's the heir to the throne. But she's so criticised for it, and you just see it time and again with women in the period. But Matilda really carries on and keeps on going, and while she never quite wins the English crown, she definitely keeps her claim alive, and in the long term, she's the victor.
And I think that's what's so significant, because Henry I says to the barons, choose my daughter. When I die, she's going to be the one in charge. This will be the first queen. It's a big moment. And the barons say, well, OK, we'll do that. But when Henry dies, she's not in England. So she starts heading back to get the throne, and then Stephen nips in fast, like someone who gets a parking space before you do in the multi-story. He gets in there with his Metro and, you know, with his Ford Fiesta, and he's there. And what does interest me is that the anarchy that follows is that even though he's the man, even though, of course, he has a claim, he has royal blood, there is this belief that she should have got it. And people don't automatically say, oh, well, fine, he's the man and he should take it. There is this long argument and big battles between it, which shows, I think, the respect for her and an interest and a support for female monarchy, even though it was such a sexist time. And partly that's due to her character. And then, of course, as we were saying, her son is the one who does eventually get the throne. So it's her bloodline that matters. And so
she does win the day.
She's always the power behind the throne.
So do you think, in terms of, like, the long course of queens in the medieval period, do you think she was just like, she was almost ahead of her time and people weren't ready for that at that point?
Yeah, and I think we were just saying, weren't we, outside, that if she'd been in England, I think, and been able to get into that coronation ceremony fast, she would have beaten Stephen and she would have been accepted. Of course, I would say he probably would have challenged her, but I think it was just a logistical...
It was geography.
Error that she wasn't there. It was
that
just
thwarted
geography.
her.
The Eurostar wasn't fast enough coming over. And so that, I think, you know, she would have been a fantastic queen. I think she was ahead of her time, but I think everything that what's interesting is everything that she went through as a consort prepared her to be a queen, and we don't often see women that way. We don't often see that the role of a wife and a consort and a mother can prepare you to be a monarch, but it does.
Yeah. Well, Empress Matilda was born into royalty with her destiny well and truly mapped out for her. We're going to turn our attentions now to Jeffrey Hudson, whose story is remarkable, but there is not even blue blood running through his veins. Talk to me about Jeffrey and why you featured him in the book and why he's so significant in our royal history.
OK, so Jeffrey Hudson is someone who it's a really fascinating insight into the royal court in the Stuart period, and I think, you know, it's we often view these courts through the kings and queens or the the figures, well, the royalty, I guess. But he is just as important, and I think I just really want to include him to kind of give that angle of somebody who was an ordinary person arriving at the royal court. And he was born in 1619, and he was born in Oakham in Rutland. Rutland is this county in the centre of England. It's England's smallest county, and he was born to a very humble origins. His father was a butcher, and he kind of arranged the entertainment for the Duke of Buckingham, who was this incredibly important figure at court. But
the Duke of Buckinghamshire was so Geoffrey's dad was his butcher.
Yeah.
So that was the kind of the route in.
So that was his home life.
And the Duke liked the butcher and used him for providing food, but also for helping with entertaining.
Mm-hmm.
And
bull baiting, right? So this is the thing. This is why we think it's very hard to kind of piece these things together. But there was this popular sport in the 17th century called bull baiting, which is pretty horrific.
You'll be pleased to know it no longer is a thing.
Yeah.
Hurrah!
But it's amazing because people, ladies at court to ordinary men, everyone found this an enjoyable thing to watch, which is really hard for us to imagine because it seems so cruel. And what they would do is they'd have these dogs that would go to attack the bull, and eventually the bull would die. But it's a really cruel thing. They had these dogs where they'd have this bite that wouldn't be able to be
It's really a
released.
fair fight, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty horrific. But the reason that Jeffrey Hudson's father was involved was because often the butcher was the person who had the dogs and worked with the meat and all this kind of stuff. So that's why he would... Basically, Jeffrey Hudson's father would provide this entertainment or at the local kind of house of the Duke of Buckingham, which was near Oakham. And so we think that's probably how they had this relationship, because the key thing with Jeffrey Hudson is he was very, very small. He was born with dwarfism of kind that we don't really see today, but he was very, very small, and they couldn't explain it at the time. People had no idea why.
His mother became quite alarmed after his first birthday. She noticed that there was that he wasn't growing in the same way
because his siblings were not like that at all. And his father was a butcher who was like a big, he had to be a big, strong man. So
and they worried for him, like what will become of him?
Exactly, yeah.
Who will care for him? Will he be able to care for himself? Will he be able to work? So what happens next is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, so, I mean, I suppose probably the most likely course for someone like this in that period would have been maybe joining some of the travelling fairs. They had lots of fairs in kind of entertainment fairs, which we'd probably see as quite cruel today. But Geoffrey Hudson's father made this amazing connection, really, where he presented Geoffrey to the Duke of Buckinghamshire, to the Duke of Buckingham, and his wife, the Duchess, was totally taken by him for whatever reason. We don't know if it was. Let's
take a look at some images that we have. Because he's in the National Portrait Gallery. This is a man of historical significance. Let's take a look at some other images that we have of him. When you say this is King Charles I. When you say he was a small person, he was a small person.
He was really small. Yeah. So what's extraordinary is that he was brought into the household of the Duke of Buckingham, which was an extraordinary step up for somebody who's a butcher's son in Rutland to then be someone who has servants, who has smart clothes, and then he gets brought into the royal household. And Henrietta Maria...
When you say brought in, he provides entertainment.
Right. It's kind of hard to read if this was something that was exploitative or it's something that could be discussed. But he was brought in, and he was kind of provided as a friend for Henrietta Maria, who was this young French queen who was quite unhappy at this point, and she seemed to adore him.
This is her with him there.
He is painted alongside the queen. I mean, this is an honour that any other courtier could only dream of, to be painted by the likes of Van Dyck with the Queen of the day. It is quite an extraordinary position to be in. But what we learn from Geoffrey is that he's obviously this amazingly colourful character, and though people admit in their writings that he was obviously brought in because of his physical form, actually he was this wonderful character that people seem to adore. So there were lots of kind of poems and things written about him and celebrated about him.
But also he was really underestimated in as much as, don't just look at this man, listen to him. He's witty, he's charming, he's intelligent, and he has the ear of some very powerful people. And the Queen takes to him with huge affection and really leans upon him as an advisor, a confidant. And suddenly, he has a very powerful seat at a very powerful table.
I think he is an incredible personality, and the Duke of Buckingham's household, I mean, the Duke of Buckingham has so much power over society at the time.
Does he?
He is, you know...
Because dukes of today don't really hold that same sway.
He's not like the Duke you only see in the coronation. I mean, this is a Duke who is controlling the country. I mean, and is a man who himself has worked his way up from very low origins through being charming and handsome and good-looking. So it's a very... To be in his household, I think, is an apprenticeship in how to be the ideal courtier. And being a courtier is a tough Game of Thrones life, not in terms of physical danger, but in terms of you could always be undermined, you could always lose it, everyone wants your position, and you have to be charming, you have to be witty, and you have to be always on your toes. And I think what we see with Jeffrey is he's both very intelligent, but I also wonder, I don't know what you think, that he's perhaps dismissed a bit. People dismiss his intelligence and they underestimate him, and people tell him a lot of things because they underestimate him, and there he goes, and he actually becomes someone who knows everything, and knowledge is power.
But also, do you not think that they just literally overlooked him? That they didn't take him seriously? They didn't realise that he had this great brain, this ability to absorb information, to pass information around into more important ears and become very influential.
I mean, his height was obviously his way into the court, but you don't become that close to the Queen, particularly, without having something more to you. You know, he's clearly intelligent. He is clearly witty, as Kate said. You know, he's clearly got a lot going on.
He goes to France with her, doesn't he?
He does.
To find a midwife. She miscarries.
Yes.
And, you know, and he'd seen that he must go with her. That, you know, she couldn't be without him.
The most important job, to find a midwife for the royal heir. And I don't know, I wonder a little bit myself, is that queens aren't really allowed to have male friends. We see it with Anne Boleyn. It's something that gets you into all kinds of trouble. And of course, we all like to have friends of the opposite sex. And she's allowed to have a friend of the opposite sex because people dismiss him. They don't see him as a, you know, this is obviously very prejudiced. They don't see him as a real man. So she has,
well, let's think about how he was
to talk to and ask male advice from. And he's someone who knows what men are thinking and what the Duke of Buckingham is thinking, which is, I think, is a very important piece of insight.
Yeah.
The way he's introduced to this royal setup is, well, does he jump out of a pie?
Yeah, so the story is that he is presented by the Duke of Buckingham. Who organises this banquet, this feast for the royal couple, and he's brought in this pie, a cold pie, and he emerges in this suit of armour. So that's the kind of way he arrives at court. And I don't think that sounds completely ridiculous, and it is, but also I think it just gives you an insight into the kind of the lifestyle and the drama and the theatre that was at these courts. You know, there's all kinds of things happening like that in these masques at the time.
I mean, they're all quite bored. A lot of the time, and actually they've got to find entertainments and the newest thing, and you know, the court is the centre of fashion, and everyone is trying to present something new or exciting to the king and the queen.
So sorry.
So it's obviously, you know, it was a terrible waste of food that a pie comes in and it's wasted. But I think that is an entry that no one's ever going to forget. And the Duke of Buckingham, you know, he knows his theatrics. It's like you say, it's like the importance of masks and theatre.
Yeah.
He knows how to put on a spectacle.
Well, it's a bit like Marilyn Monroe and the birthday cake, isn't it, to some extent?
Yeah, it's just like that. Well, and I mean, I think that it's just, you have to remember that all this stuff was happening when he was very, very young. If we're thinking about teenage lives in Britain, you know, or at the court across all these centuries, like, this is a remarkable one. Irrelevant of his physical size, it's quite incredible that he was chosen to go across the channel to visit Marie de Medici and, you know, be at court there. He was doing this already before the age he was 18 to source this new midwife. And then when they return across the channel, there's this incident where there are pirates that board the ship, and you know, it must have been an incredibly dramatic moment, and everyone's kind of an uproar that they might lose some of the favourites of the royal court. And they do eventually return, and it is the midwife that he returns with who eventually delivers King Charles II. So you could say that he played a pretty important role in, you know, that Stuart family.
And, you know, and it's the most, for any woman, it's the most terrifying prospect, having your baby, and that he's the one who's supporting her in finding this crucial midwife. I mean, that's just so significant. And I think, you know, I think he was the perfect court.
Well, the fact that most teenagers of the 17th century, for them, being painted by Anthony van Dyck would have been like mind-blowing, once in a lifetime opportunity.
It's like TikTok going 2 million viral.
Yeah. I mean, it's huge. But for him, it was just another day at the office, right? He was casual about it because he was so entrenched in royal circles. And then you're right. He's coming back, mission accomplished. He's found the midwife that's going to deliver the future king. But what happens? Because then his life takes a disastrous turn.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jeffrey Hudson's really interesting because when you look at most teenagers and most people's lives, they start in these, their teenage years are probably very humble, and then suddenly they explode and become very famous or something. But what's strange about Jeffrey is he has this moment of fame. He almost peaks in his very, very young years. So he probably peaks when he's like 15 or 14 or something like that. Because in the Stuart court, obviously something terrible happens. Whilst we've got all these masks and this pageantry and this kind of beauty and all of these exciting things happening, the Civil War breaks out. And so the Civil War changes everything. And Jeffrey is part of that. So he's with Henrietta Maria and he's in France. And then we don't really know what happens to him, but he kind of falls into trouble. And then, in a disastrous, horrific turn of events, he somehow gets captured by pirates, by Barbary pirates, and he is enslaved for the best part of 25 years. So he spends a quarter of a century we don't know, we can only imagine, but it must have been, being in slavery of some kind, and that is obviously kind of a completely appalling, horrific way.
So many would have assumed he was dead at this point.
Yeah.
As years turn to decades, one
So
decade turns to another. He's gone, and then
he comes
what?
back. Then he comes back, and what a strange thing for him to be away and then to come back and to see England post-Civil War. Charles II, who he provided the midwife for, is on the throne, and he's not really welcomed into court. He goes back to his... Well, he faces trouble because there's kind of Catholic... he's kind of seen as an unpopular figure. But anyway, he sort of just dissolves into quite a sad end.
He lives out his final days quietly, but unremarkably, having had this very dazzling existence for the very early years of his life.
Yeah.
Remarkable. I mean...
So it's a peak. It's such an early peak, and then it's so strange how, someone can become so famous, like the biggest celebrity, and it can all go, it can all disappear.
So hard to capture all of that as you walk past this at the National Portrait Gallery, and I go, I wonder who he is. Well, now you know. What a remarkable story.
But the story, I mean, his role was the Queen's dwarf. That was his title. But that wasn't unusual in courts in Europe, was it?
No, I mean, there was Louis XIV's wife, Maria. She had, it was quite a pop. I mean, we would see it now. It's so barbaric. People like to have sort of a. I mean, it's a terrible word, a kind of novelty servant, and it's very distressing. And he, people think it's fascinating. So he is being used as a curiosity, and he. I mean, he has such a powerful intellect that he supersedes being used as a curiosity and a clown and a joke. But I think as he gets older, he gets more and more frustrated by being treated like this, doesn't it? One thing being treated like this when he's a teenager, but as he becomes a mature man, and he's been so trusted, he becomes increasingly frustrated that he's being treated as a sort of joke character, and that's, I think that caused a lot of his frustration in France, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's why there's reports of him being in fights and things because of that sort of thing, which is fair enough.
Poor Jeff. I feel for the guy.
But I'm always, it's amazing when you write about these characters. I don't know if you have this when you write about people from history, but you become so proud of them.
Oh, you do.
I feel proud that he did so well, being this butcher's son, who must have faced so many difficulties in his life, and then he stunned one of the most powerful courts in Europe, and he took it in his stride
and helped to rule the roost for a while.
I think if it wasn't for the Civil War, his life would be very different.
And he'd probably be far more prominent in our history books.
He played the hand he was dealt, and he played it really well until you get the Civil War and events completely out of his control.
Suddenly they're in exile, and I think it really. being a courtier is such a tough life. So I'm stunned by the ones who get to the top of that rather terrifying Christmas tree, particularly the ones who come from nothing. Because there are some who are put in there because of their parents' networks and connections. But from those who come from nothing, now they would have so many survival skills, so many brilliant skills. I think they'd be prime minister. I mean, they are the master of social interaction.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting when he comes back and Charles II is on the throne. He doesn't get involved in that court as well at all, and so you wonder if he, couldn't get back in, or actually because he'd been put in this position quite early on, he didn't really maybe he didn't have the power to manoeuvre when it was a different person on the throne. It's all speculation, of course, but
Wow.
But but it's interesting, there's all these figures from the court, royal courts, that aren't Charles and Henrietta Maria or Elizabeth or Empress Matilda, and he was just as large a figure as any of those people would have been if you'd been there in person, I think. So it's amazing that they've just been missed out of. I learnt about Charles, this period in A-level history, and we learnt all about the court. I never heard of him.
I was going to say, but Jeffrey didn't feature.
Jeffrey.
Let's turn now to Elizabeth I. Everything in her life that could go wrong did when she was growing up. For a start, being born as a girl, that was a disaster. Henry VIII did not want a daughter.
Whoops.
He wanted an heir. And it was pretty much a struggle from there on in. The face did not fit, did it?
Yeah, well, I always think about, if you take Elizabeth at the age of 18, and she had visited a therapist, say, today, and she'd had to sit on the sofa and say, this is the kind of things that have gone on, there would be so much to dissect. It would just be impossible, because we said earlier that although she comes from this royal background, she had one of the most traumatic, certainly one of the most traumatic kind of upbringings in royal history, in English history, perhaps. Just as a very brief note, as a toddler, her mother was executed by her father. She then had 4 stepmothers. At the arrival of each of them, her position in the family and the court on the world stage was recalibrated, repositioned, and then her father dies, and then there's this terrible episode with Thomas Seymour, who's this figure who was married to
Catherine Parr.
Maybe we'll get onto that. But it's basically a kind of sexual abuse story, and then by the age of 18, she's endured all of that already. So that's the kind of whoever the woman is that ends up out of that is
she ends up being our Virgin Queen. You can understand. We'll come to why. But she really didn't have much of an appetite for men. Elizabeth was born in 1533 at Greenwich Palace. Her father was King Henry VIII, who'd put a lot on the line for the birth of this child. He'd broken from the Catholic Church in Rome, started the Church of England, and split from his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry a younger woman who'd caught his eye, Anne Boleyn, her mother. So all of that had to happen in order for her to arrive in the world, right? When she arrives, he's literally like, are you kidding me?
Well, he cancels the tournament he's planned to celebrate the birth. He instantly just goes, nope, it's
rude.
And I feel rather sorry for the court astrologers, because there's 2 choices. They can say girl or boy, and they say, oh, boy, definitely, because what else would you say if you're a court astrologer? And they're wrong. And they're also convinced that Elizabeth is a boy, that when Anne Boleyn has her coronation ceremony and she's pregnant, she is actually crowned with St Edward's crown, which is only ever for the monarch. It's never ever happened otherwise for the consort. And that is because it's believed that she's got this boy.
She's cooking an heir.
She's cooking an heir, and so they're crowning him as well. And so therefore, there's debates, aren't there, about how Henry receives Elizabeth's birth. It generally is thought that he was disappointed, but he felt they would go on to have more children. So it's a start, but Anne needs, within 6 months, to be back in business again. And this is what doesn't happen.
So then Anne Boleyn was an evil seductress, apparently.
Well, according to Henry VIII, at least,
According to Henry. And what did he do when he arrived at that conclusion?
So he beheads her for adultery and incest. It's pretty clearly trumped-up charges. The charges don't really make any sense. But for Elizabeth, it has the crucial... of course, she also loses her mother.
And she's 2 years and 8 months old at this point. He then, not only does he behead her mother, but he then declares her a bastard.
He does.
And cuts her from the line of royal succession.
she's lady now, so she loses her title, so she becomes lady, and she's lost everything. And so Mary, her sister, she's now pushed up, and Henry continues his search for an heir, and he's convinced that wife number 3, Jane Seymour, can give him one, which of course she does. She has baby Edward, and it's heartbreaking about Anne Boleyn. The sources show that some of the last...
and we know that Jane was not keen on Elizabeth, paid her very little attention. Henry was really not that bothered either. So we just see her being pushed into the background until Anne of Cleves comes along, and she's considered to be the fairy godmother. She doted on Elizabeth.
This is how I try to think about all of these different stepmothers in a kind of simplistic way. But Anne of Cleves was she seemed to be pretty fond of Elizabeth. I think there's some quote that she says that she would have been so proud if she'd been her daughter.
I mean, all of this back and forth, the not knowing where you stand from one minute to the next. Is my mother dead or alive? Oh, she's bareheaded, bit of both, Oh, geez. I mean, it's just awful.
And should you get close to a stepmother? How long are they going to last?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't last long.
They don't last long.
Well, yeah, because then along comes Catherine Howard, who follows Anne of Cleves.
And she's a Boleyn. She's on side with with Elizabeth I, because they're part of the same family.
But then she's executed at 18.
Yeah.
And Elizabeth's quite fond of her, isn't she? Catherine Howard, gives her little presents and things. And so, Elizabeth, and Elizabeth's hopeful because she knows that she has to get favour with her father, and the way to do so is through a wife. But then they disappear, and it's the most, as you say, the most destabilising childhood.
Life trauma, trauma of it all.
She hasn't actually got that much money. We see these heartbreaking letters from her sort of housekeeper governess saying, I haven't got any money for Elizabeth at all. So, and she's shoved away from court. When you're a princess, sometimes you're fated, and sometimes you have a worse life than many other women in the whole country.
And I mean, even to sort of add insult to injury, she's raised, so the young Edward, her younger half-brother, is sent to be raised with her governess. And immediately all the letters from the governess go from sort of talking about Elizabeth to talking about Edward, how adorable he is, how he starts walking, how he dances.
What a genius.
Music. What a genius he is. And Elizabeth is just in the background. She's this older sister who is, she is no longer the focus of anyone's attention.
Yeah, she loses that mother figure. She's again and again and again, she loses a parental figure.
Until the arrival of Catherine Parr, and of all of her stepmothers, she was the one that really took a huge interest in her, took her under her wing and treated her like she was a daughter. And then Henry dies.
Yeah, and I think Catherine Parr, they had a good relationship, and that could have been worked well. And she was living in the household of Catherine Parr, and they were very intellectual women, and they talked a lot about books and things. But then it all goes wrong because, unfortunately, she makes the wrong decision to marry her next husband, who's Thomas Seymour.
He's our baddie.
Yes,
yeah, we've all got to boo now he comes on stage.
Yeah. So if you're interested in Thomas Seymour, there is a whole episode that we've done together discussing the Thomas Seymour affair. Do check it out. But in the meantime, briefly, Thomas Seymour, give me the skinny on him, how dangerous he is, and the havoc he wreaked.
He's a terrible person, and he is dangerous, and what he wants is power. And his brother, so he's Jane Seymour's brother, who's Henry VIII's third wife, the mother of the king now, Edward VI, now Henry is dead. And his brother has got all the power over this young Edward VI. So our Thomas Seymour, other Seymour, is so annoyed, he thinks, I'm going to get power by getting it over Catherine, the Dowager Queen. She's always liked him. She marries him. I don't think he ever had any affection for. He was just aiming for power. He marries her to really...
He conceives with him?
Put the nose of his brother out of joint. And she conceives with him, and he wants to get power because she's the Dowager Queen, but also he wants to get power over Elizabeth, who's in her household. And what he starts to do is this really horrific campaign of sexual abuse, as you were saying, against Elizabeth. He comes into her, because he has this position of father, so he can come into her bedroom early in the morning, he can cuddle her and show she's being groomed and harassed. And the reason is that he's hopeful that he can get Catherine out of the way, marry Elizabeth, and get
Catherine catches him and a young Elizabeth in what is considered to be a compromising situation, and she's devastated, quite rightly, whilst carrying his child. to see this. She feels...
It's appalling for both of them.
I mean, it's just such a mess. And I mean, it's all his fault.
He could have, if he'd been a kind father to her, if he'd been a proper stepfather to her, he could have actually seen himself in a position of power later on. But instead, he abuses her, and it's because he wants to get into the affections by sexually harassing her. I mean, he comes short of actually sexually attacking her,
but he climbs into her bed.
I reckon he's not far off.
He also cuts her dress at one stage. Well, in fact, while Catherine is holding her, so he slashes her dress to pieces, and there's nothing anyone can do. So her governess, says, "Why is your dress? Why are you sort of holding your dress up around you?" And as soon as she knows it's Thomas Seymour that did it, there's nothing they can do because he's in charge in the household.
So he's a bit of a tyrant, right?
Yeah.
So does this explain, do you think, why she ended up the Virgin Queen and just never really bothered to pursue a romantic relationship again?
I mean, she clearly is attracted to men. That's obvious with Elizabeth I. She has male favourites, Robert Dudley, for example. But she's got no positive examples of marriage in her family at all. None at all. It's always a disaster.
And that's an understatement.
Yes. Anne Boleyn's, even in the Boleyn family, Anne Boleyn's uncle, of course, who helps bring her down. And it's interesting, isn't it, about Elizabeth, that many princesses in her position would have been betrothed and married very early on, as we saw with Matilda. But she's not used as this marriage pawn.
Well, because she wasn't seen as significant.
She's not important. So in a sense,
she'd been renounced at one point and announced a bastard.
Yes, who would want to marry which European
They didn't really bother with her.
She was his.
So really, she ended up having the last laugh. And we talked about Matilda earlier. Matilda had started to set an agenda that she was then able to pick up on again, and she went on to become quite a remarkable queen. She was on the throne for how long?
44 years.
Pretty good run.
So I think, and I think if you look at her, I mean, it's all inevitable in hindsight, or at least we have hindsight, so we forget that she didn't know that was about to happen. But I do think when you look at Elizabeth's young life, and this is why I included her in the book, and she goes through all of those difficulties, and she learns to, manage all of those things. That is such an insight into the way that she reigns and the way that she rules. In that, one of the big things she did is she always chose this middle way. She was more cautious, I'd say. She wasn't quick to trust people, or she never got married. So I see a kind of cautious approach in lots of the things she does later on.
So we call it post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Well, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean, she had there's definitely something like that going on.
Yeah, say the therapist would be,
sure.
okay, this is going to be a long job.
Yeah.
And you think when your half brother thinks about chopping your head off,
right, yeah.
and then your half-sister thinks about chopping your head off.
There's a difficult relationship with her half-siblings.
She only just got out of being executed by both, by her wits. So she survives with her life intact. She survives with her virginity only just intact because of this horrific sexual abuse. I mean, she gets to the throne. She's seen everything, and so, as you say, she's. I think this does completely create her going the middle way, because she's seen what happens with extreme passions, and this creates, carnage.
Yeah, and she can. That's a really good point.
And her fear of but also, with marriage, this is the problem. We've seen it with Mary I. You marry a man, he tries to get power. It's not popular. You might die in childbirth, and if you have a boy, immediately he'll be seen as superseding you. So there are lots of reasons against marriage, but I think, above all, she saw how it can take everything from a woman.
Yeah.
Remarkable stories that you've really brought into focus for us today. Thank you so much. Good luck with the book. 18 is out and available now, and it features 18 stories about 18 remarkable 18-year-olds that really have become very formative in our British history. So congratulations.
Thank you so
much for coming. And thank you, as always, for providing so much insight. If you enjoyed this, there's plenty more of The Royal Beat back in time on True Royalty TV. Until next time, do keep the conversation going with us on our socials. You can find us everywhere. We're at True Royalty TV.